this schedule really shapes up for a playoff run with a 12-team playoff.
Areas that, you need to get from experience, which is just, hey, I need to make quicker decisions.
How do you define success for this team?
National championship.
What's going on, y'all? Bud Elliott here of the Cover 3 College Football Podcast. It's my summer school series, and today, Washington State. That's my man, Jamey Vinnick of Coug fan. He's joined us a number of times before, and looking forward to chopping it up again. Jamey, welcome back to the show, man.
Appreciate you having me back.
This is our ninth of the day, so I'm a little caffeinated, but always excited to talk to Cougs, who treated me very nicely as I bested Danny, Chip, and Tom in our college fantasy league last year, and a whole lot of changes from that team to this team. So let's start at the top. Jimmy Rogers comes in from South Dakota State as the former coach leaves for Wake Forest. What changes should we expect because of the coaching changes, and what changes should we expect maybe because of personnel?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest one is just it's going to be a different offense. I mean, Washington State fans over the last decade and a half have known one offense, and it's been the air raid. I mean, with some of the variations, the run and shoot when it was Rolovich and, whatever, I think the Coug raid or whatever Dickert wanted to call that last offense, but it was still mainly air raid principles. This won't be. This is going to be, with Danny Freund's offense, more of a balanced attack, probably a little more emphasis on the run game. I mean, not going to be triple option, not going to be, just run the ball 70 times, but, there's going to be more of a balance and more of a desire and an insistence on running the ball. That's kind of what this offense is predicated on. But with still plenty of passing. I mean, guys aren't going to be throwing it 70 times a game anymore. I mean, I don't think you're going to see anything like that, but you're not going to see 10 to 12 passes a game unless it's, one of those where nothing can be stopped on the ground. But I think that's the biggest shift is it's going to be a very different looking offense. Defensively, it's a shift back to more of the traditional 4-3. Dickert and Leach before that, or whoever Leach's defensive coordinator was before that, I should say, always ran a 4-2-5. This is going to be more the traditional 4-3. You got the 4 down linemen, you got defensive ends instead of edges or rushes. And then you've got 3 linebackers, Will, Mike, and Sam, with the Sam kind of rotating it in and out on passing downs. And, your conventional 4 defensive backs, 2 corners, 2 safeties, not as much nickel stuff. It's still going to be there. I think it's going to be more situational. But, I think the base 4-2-5 that, had its ups and downs at Washington State is, for the most part, it's not their base defense anymore. So I think from that standpoint, there's a lot of wholesale changes in scheme. Personnel-wise, I think obviously you go from John Mateer to anyone in the country, it's a change. Zevi Eckhouse really was neck and neck with Mateer last August. I think Zevi's probably a steadier quarterback in the sense of he's a little more kind of even-keeled. There isn't maybe going to be so much of the roller coaster there sometimes was with Mateer, which most times worked out very well for Washington State. He was a high-octane player and an incredible player. I mean, certainly not suggesting that Mateer wasn't spectacular. I think Eckhouse it's going to be a little more here, whereas Mateer is you get your highs here, the lows were maybe a little bit lower, kind of the high ceiling, lower floor, and granted, the high ceiling was really what was featured with Mateer, but I think Eckhouse is going to kind of within the offensive shift. It's going to be a little bit more of a game manager. Your job is to get the ball to your playmakers, whereas Mateer was kind of counted on to do just about everything last year. He was the playmaker. And it's not that Eckhouse can't do that. It's just I think when you look at the weapons Washington State has around him, specifically at running back, he doesn't have to do some of the things that Mateer or even Cam Ward had to do. There's going to be a little more of an emphasis on getting the ball out, getting the ball into the hands of the speed guys, the skill guys, and kind of letting them create. And then within that, I don't know if it's going to be the home run offense. It's not going to be the 4 verts that Leach used to, kind of specialize in, where it's 50-yard, 60-yard passes. It's going to be a lot of 8-yard chunks, 10-yard chunks, 11-yard chunks, which, you can run that effectively. You're pretty hard to stop.
So who will be the recipient of the increased carries, obviously? If Eckhouse isn't going to run it maybe quite as much as Mateer did, Wayshawn Parker hit the transfer portal. Who are we expecting to be like that guy at running back this year?
That's a good question. I think right now you'd say Angel Johnson. He was South Dakota State's number 2 guy last year, but played a ton. That all being said, he was out all of spring ball. I think he had some kind of surgery on his foot to get something cleaned up. Won't affect him for the season or anything. So we didn't really see much of him in the spring. And then you factor in Dylan Payne was out all spring, and you factor in Juvensky Schlembaker transferred mid-spring. Max Woods was hurt part of the spring, and it was basically, just an absolute open season with carries for Leo Pulalasi, Kirby Voorhees, and Josh Joyner. Well, Joyner has now also entered the portal. So I think you're going to see a lot of guys get carries. I think there's a lot of varying skill sets. You know, Pulalasi's pretty balanced and kind of having some power, having a little bit of speed, some pass catching. Voorhees is an absolute brute, just a total bowling ball. He was their number 3 back last year, but played a pretty significant role, especially in short yardage. Woods is really shifty, really a speed guy who can get to the boundary and really make some magic happen. Payne is, another short yardage guy who had some big moments for Wazoo last year before he tore his ACL. Really good pass blocker as well. But I think when you look at who's going to be the most used guy, I think it will be Angel Johnson. But I don't know if it's going to be a bell cow where he's going to get 90% of the carries. I really do think they're going to use 4, if not 5 different guys. But when they run out for those first plays against Idaho in August, I'd be pretty surprised at this juncture if Angel Johnson's not the number 1 guy.
Despite the reduced passing, do want to ask about the pass catcher. So Williams is gone, Hudson's gone, Mathers is gone. Who do we expect to be the recipients of the passes this year?
Yeah, I think bringing Josh Meredith back was a huge victory for the program. He was a guy who, went on in an interview and said, I bleed crimson, I'm not leaving. 1 week later, coaching change happens. He hops in the portal. He sees what's out there, eventually comes back. Veteran guy, was really reliable for him last year, had a massive Apple Cup. He's going to be one of their top guys out of the slot. I think Devin Ellison, who was a JUCO receiver, they beat out Boise and UCF to get him. He was hurt part of the spring, but you saw even in the limited spring visibility, you saw some of the big playability of what a guy like him can do with size, with speed. Leighton Smithson, who was, kind of a breakout guy as a freshman back in 2022, fell down the depth chart in 23, moved to safety in 24. He's now back at receiver. He had a really good spring, looked, quite frankly, more confident than he ever has catching the ball, and there's certainly no doubting his speed. He's been the kick returner the last few years. Assume he will do that again. They brought in Jeremiah Noga from Oregon State, a veteran receiver. I think will add to some depth on the outside. And then they've got some young guys. They got Brandon Ganashamurthy, a former track guy who was just kind of pretty new to football when he joined the Wazoo program a couple of years ago. Started to show some flashes last year, had a touchdown in the bowl game. Tony Freeman made some plays last year at various points. Speedy slot guy. I think he's a guy you could see potentially make a difference. Leon Neal, another veteran, a former walk-on who hasn't gotten a chance to really get on the field, but I think you see the opportunity, you see the potential for him to do so. And then I think when you look at the tight end position, Trey Lechner's the guy who kind of stands out as maybe the Mathers replacement in terms of a pure pass catcher. They've got a few tight ends. I think they've got a lot of good blocking tight ends, but I think when you look at who can kind of replace what Mathers did with, his touchdown proficiency, Lechner stands out as that guy. He showed flashes last year, and I think he's going to be a guy that Eckhouse is going to have a pretty good bonding connection with.
So it should still be a pretty decent passing offense. Maybe not quite, what it was last year, obviously, with Mateer and those guys. Offensive line, we feel pretty decent about it. I think we had said pre-recording. Anything we need to add there?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that they lost a handful of guys to Wake Forest. Devin Kalani, Rod Tilavea, Lili Fatmoe all went to Wake Forest with Jake Dickert. Esapole goes pro, ends up signing with the Chiefs. But I think if you honestly ask anyone who was around the team last year, Washington State brought back their best 2 linemen outside of Pole, and that's Christian Hilborn, that's Brock Dew. I mean, they were far and away their most consistent guys, and in my opinion, they were their 2 best in addition to Pole. Dew's going to be at center now, Hilborn at guard. And then they added a lot of veteran guys in the spring portal. They added AJ Vaipulu from New Mexico State, who's been an all-conference guy. They added Jalen Caldwell from Grand Valley State. I mean, a guy that a handful of Power 5 teams, SEC and Big Ten, were after. They've got some young guys. I know they like Noah Dunham's a guy who's been in the program a couple of years, a lot of upside there. Guys like Ashton Tripp, Xavier Thorpe maybe end up waiting another year now, but, very athletic, talented tackles. They brought in Sone Falealo from Idaho, another kind of one of those high upside guys. So I think bringing back Dew and Hilborn really set the tone for what the offensive line can be. And I think we saw what could be a solid offensive line in the spring. And then I think they went ahead and just added to it, especially when you're talking Caldwell and Vaipulu, because on paper, those are plug and play guys at left tackle and most likely left guard.
So, is there a guy we've not mentioned yet who is not really projected to do this, but if he did hit his ceiling, maybe that's a guy who like has never done it and kind of written him off, but like he's still around and the potential's still there, or maybe a young guy who, like, if he plays to his potential earlier than we expect, really any offensive position would really change what this offense can be.
On offense, I would say I think you start looking at tight end, and the guy that I look at is Bo Baker, a South Dakota State transfer. By the time his recruitment was done, he was a 4-star recruit going to South Dakota State. Tore his ACL early last year, but you look at the frame, 6'6", 253. He was still recovering in the spring. He was doing some kind of individual drills on the side, but I think when you look at a guy like that, you look at what he was able to do in high school, kind of to earn that rating. Again, we're talking about a 4-star guy who at the end of the day was going to South Dakota State out of Springfield, Kentucky. I think if he can become that prospect, and again, you look at the size, you look at the physicality, the tools are there. If he can become how good he was projected to be coming out of high school in the class of 24, that's the type of guy who could become an absolute menace and a matchup nightmare in that tight end position, just in the fact that he's got the size of the block. And if he can become the pass catcher, develop soft hands, be able to win jump balls, that's the type of guy that could change an offense, especially in the red zone.
All right, let's take a quick break here. On the flip side, we'll talk a little Coug defense.
When you need your sports news all the time,
we've got breaking news to bring to you.
CBS Sports HQ gives you a snapshot of all the sports that matter to you. When you need your sports in a snap, find it on CBS Sports HQ, streaming free anywhere you are.
All right, guys, welcome back into the Cover 3 College Ball Podcast, Summer School Edition. Washington State is in session. That's Jamey Vinnick of Coug Fan doing an awesome job of covering all things Cougs for us. Defense, obviously new scheme, more 4-3, less 3-4. Gusta, Dinmabu, Edson, Lafau, Webster. Man, there's a long list of guys on this defensive front who are gone. And yet the list of transfers is about as long. So they're not hurting for bodies. Can you help me sort this out as far as who might start and like who are your potential impact guys here to the extent we can even figure it out? Because I know there's so many new faces, it's probably hard.
Yeah, I mean, you said it. They got hit hard on the defensive line. Basically every defensive end they had, veteran guy graduated. Edson, Milani, Webster, Roth, all graduating. You look at defensive tackle, you lose Gusta, who, I've been on record, I think other places saying this, and I'll say it. He was their best player last year. That includes Mateer and that includes Williams. I think that was not a great defense last year, and I shudder to think what it would have been without Gusta. And I think Kentucky has an absolute steal. Kentucky fans, if you see that, trust me, you got a good one. But Dinbu obviously was the Pac-12 Defensive Player of the Year, and the two of the two teams. Although again, I would argue that he benefited a lot from what Gusta was able to do in tying up blockers. Ufau was a really good kind of third piece, and it hurt to lose those guys. But as you said, they brought in a lot of bodies, especially on the interior. You got Max Balloon, who was a two-year starter at SDSU on a couple national title teams, or 3-year starter on a couple national title teams. Caden Beatty from Kent State was one of very few bright spots on a bad Kent State team last year. Sony Finau from Cal Poly. It's been a long time since Wazoo had a guy this big. We're talking 6'2", 340 pounds in the middle of the defense. Bryson Lamb was a guy who earned a role last season, a former walk-on. He's been pretty firmly in the mix. And then they went and they made some moves in the transfer portal as well. They got Mike Yohan Sanjo and Jickie from SMU. They got Darian Dalton from San Diego State. So I think when you look at the interior, there's a lot of bodies there. And I think there's probably some hope from the coaching staff that between Connor Sullivan, Donovan Fitzmaurice, and Elijah Tucker, the three incoming freshmen, I think there's some confidence that one of those guys is going to be able to push his way into the rotation. And judging on some of the tape of those guys, there is certainly that opportunity. When you look out to defensive end, again, we talked about there were so many guys that graduated, but they did bring back a handful of key guys. Ray Stevenson's a guy that you kind of been waiting for the breakout now for a few years. And I think the hope is maybe a new scheme kind of allows him to tap into what's always been pretty sky-high potential. Bobby Terrell, who has shown a lot when he's gotten on the field. It was always kind of a point of confusion the last couple of years is why he didn't play more, especially as there were some injuries. I think, you look back to his freshman year. I mean, I think they burned his red shirt over like 8 snaps against Stanford. And I think that was confusing at the time. He's actually been a pretty outspoken guy on how he's been pretty pleased with the coaching change. But, one of just your classic, just run, tireless work ethic, high motor guy. Malachi Rice, who is kind of a folk hero in Coug world, mainly because he develops into like a Heisman Trophy winner on EA 25. I mean, it's remarkable. The guy goes from like a 68 overall to like a 95 in the video game, and everyone loves him because of that. But he's an athletic guy, a guy that you see the potential there. And then they bring in Fernando Laquona from South Dakota State. You saw some upside there. There's Ben Beatty. He's another young guy, a redshirt freshman. Jack Janikowski, kind of, another one of those kind of hardworking guys, a little bit of an edge to them. And then they went to the portal. They brought in a couple New Mexico State guys, Malachi Taase and Buda Paletti. So I think the bodies are there. I think they replenish the depth. It's just going to be a matter of, can you replace that top end production, particularly when it comes to the interior where you had Gusta and Dinbu?
For sure. Back end, we feel a little better though, right?
I would say so for sure, especially compared to where things were left last year.
Who do you like in the back end, like specifically as far as guys with breakout potential?
Are we talking linebackers, secondary, or both?
I was talking about secondary.
Secondary? I mean, I think you look at Tucker Large and you see a guy who was, by some outlets an All-American at the FCS level. And he's a guy that steps on the field. And again, we're talking obviously spring practice, but you notice something different. The way that he's able to read the ball, the way he's able to make plays, it's different than a lot of safeties Washington State has had, particularly at the free safety spot. They've had some great strong safeties over the last few years. You look at Jalen Thompson, you look at Jaden Hicks, but at that free safety spot, what he's able to do is pretty darn impressive. And then you look and you've got Matt Durrance and Cale Reeder, both who have played big roles on South Dakota State. They're both going to be kind of mixing in that strong safety role. Reeder was out all spring recovering from I think it was either an ACL or an Achilles he suffered first game of last year. You've got Trey Ridley, another South Dakota State transfer with 6'2", 209-pound size, which is pretty darn enticing. Keo Patu, a holdover from the last staff, really speedy free safety. And then they go and they add a little more depth with a JUCO guy, Deron Goodman, just last week, 2 weeks ago. So I think safety was, to be blunt, their worst position last year. I think it really was a struggle for those guys. And I do think part of that was the scheme. I don't think that it was schemed well to play to their strengths, but I think safety's got a chance to be one of, if not their strongest position. You look at cornerback and obviously hit there with some losses. You lose Stephen Hall to Missouri, Ethan O'Connor to Miami, Kapena Gushkin to Ole Miss, but Jamori Colson, bringing him back, and you're hoping he has a full year to kind of really be able to get in the swing of things. I mean, he missed most of fall camp 2 years ago, sorting out some academics, got hurt at the end of fall camp last year. So when he's been on the field, the potential's been there. It's just been a matter of getting him on the field. And then Colby Humphrey came with the staff from South Dakota State where he was a starter. You've got A.J. Davis from SMU, who's played a role in the past for the Mustangs. You've got Kai Rapola from Cal Poly. And then you got some young guys like Kenny Worthy, who have shown upside when they've gotten opportunities. So I think, corner, it's not as deep as they maybe would like. I think there's a lot of trust in some of the young guys. But I think the secondary has a chance to be one of the strengths, particularly at the safety spot.
Do you think this offense is better than the defense?
That's a great question. I tend to lean towards the defense right now, if for no other reason than Rogers is a defensive guy and the number of defensive guys that South Dakota State brought. When you they brought from South Dakota State. When you look at who they brought on offense, there's Angel Johnson, there's Bo Baker, there's Woods, there's Voorhees, there's Nick Bakken on the O-line. But the top South Dakota State offensive players went elsewhere in terms of Mark Gronowski went to Iowa, Griffin Wild went to Northwestern, Amar Johnson graduated. And that's not to say the guys they brought aren't really good players, but I think when you look at that South Dakota State defense from last year and you look at who came over, I mean, guys like Large and Caleb Franzel at linebacker and Durrance and Balloon, I mean, these were their key players. These were some of their top guys. And, and some of the other ones went elsewhere. I think Adam Buck graduated. I think Bryce Hawthorne went to Iowa. Kobe Claiborne stayed at South Dakota State. So they did. I mean, they didn't bring everyone. Dallas Beanham, another guy who graduated, but I mean, Large was one of, if not their best player on defense last year. Franzel was one of their leading tacklers. Humphrey was a starter. Like, they brought a lot of their impact players, and I think just based on that, I do tend to think the defense might be a step ahead in the offense. But the flip side of that is the offense brings back two of its best offensive linemen from last year,
right?
A quarterback who's been around. They add a really talented running back. I just think that especially the safety spot, to me, tips the balance a little bit toward, I think the defense might be a little further ahead, just in the fact that so many guys know the scheme that they're about to run.
Jamey, with this schedule, I mean, it's such a mishmash of Mountain West teams and Pac-12 and then former Pac-12 and some strange non-conference right there in the middle, and obviously playing Oregon State twice. So Idaho, San Diego State, at North Texas, Washington, at Colorado State, bye week, at Ole Miss, which is like crazy, at UVA, Toledo, at Oregon State, La Tech, at JMU, host Oregon State. Unless that's not neutral, right? That is host.
For Oregon State?
For the second Oregon State game.
Yeah, that's in Pullman.
How do you define success for this team this year?
12-0. No, it's I think realistically, you get to a bowl game, everyone's going to be feeling pretty good. I think there's an understanding that it's a tough schedule. I mean, you're going to Oxford, Mississippi. Alabama doesn't always win there. I mean, that is a pretty daunting trip. I know Virginia isn't particularly great. You're still going across the country a week earlier the next week, and going to Charlottesville. James Madison's a darn good program. You got to go travel there at the end of November. Teams like North Texas, Colorado State, beatable, but those are road games. Teams on their own turf, and Wazoo's had success against Colorado State lately. Granted, they won 8 games last year. North Texas, if memory serves, was in a bowl last year, or if they weren't, they were close. But I think, the key for Washington State is going to be, you got to take care of business at home. So that's Idaho. You got to get San Diego State. You got to get Toledo, Louisiana Tech, Oregon State at home. And then you've got to find that 6th win. So is that beating Washington at home? I think obviously Cougar fans would hope so. I do think they have a very reasonable chance to win that game again. Is that getting Oregon State and Corvallis? Because if it's not one of those, okay, then you got to get a Colorado State. You got to get a North Texas. You got to get a James Madison to there. You're kind of playing with fire a little bit. Again, it's a really good team that's going across the country at the end of November. Could they go to Oxford and Charlottesville and win? I mean, I think Charlottesville is a reasonable thought that, yeah, they could go win that game. I don't know how reasonable winning in Oxford is, and that's more of a testament to the team they're playing and the location of that game. But you don't want to have to, I'll put it this way, you don't want to have to rely on beating Ole Miss to become bowl eligible. You don't want to have to rely on that end of season game against James Madison to become bowl eligible. I think at absolute worst, you want to be in a position where you go into that final game against Oregon State at home, where at absolute worst, you need to win that game to get into a bowl. And ideally, they've already clinched it by then. But I think if they can get to 6, if not 7 wins, who knows, maybe they pull out 8. I think that would all be judged a pretty solid success in year one. Again, considering, the difficulty of the schedule and just considering, the circumstances around what it was like to build towards this season when you look at everything that was lost, from quarterback to top running back to top receiver to left tackle and so on. So yeah, you get to a bowl, I think Cougar fans will be pretty satisfied.
Jamey, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, there you
go. We'll chat soon, buddy.
Yep, awesome. Appreciate it, bud.